Victorian Britain was built on a mountain of coal. It was the black heart of a global empire, the engine of progress that powered the looms, forged the steel, and drove the railways that carved up the known world. But its foundations were soaked in blood. The cost of this revolution, this unprecedented leap into modernity, was paid in darkness, deep beneath the fields and towns, by an army of men and boys who descended into the earth each day, knowing they might never see the sun again. For 8-year-old Sarah Gooder, that meant sitting all alone in pitch-black darkness for 12 hours a day. Her only job, to open and close a wooden ventilation door. "I have to trap without a light and I'm scared," she told an inspector in 1842. She was scared of the endless night, of the strange noises, of the rats that scurried over her feet. But most of all, she was scared of the thunderous roar that could signal an explosion, a collapse, or a flood. This is the story of the Victorian death traps below our feet. The story of how an entire empire was fueled by a darkness it chose to ignore. And how on one terrible day, for 26 children just like Sarah, that darkness finally came for them all. Part 1. The Black Empire. To understand the sheer, brutal scale of Victorian coal mining, you have to understand the era itself. Coal wasn't just a fuel, it was the nation's lifeblood. Without it, the Industrial Revolution would have sputtered and died. The grand factories belching smoke into the skies of Manchester and Birmingham would have fallen silent. The world's first steam-powered navy, projecting British power across every ocean, would have been nothing but become sailing ships. Coal was as vital as air, and Britain's appetite for it was insatiable. This demand created a unique and harrowing world, the mining town. These were not just communities, they were fiefdoms, often owned lock, stock, and barrel by the colliery company. The mine owner provided the houses, small, damp, poorly constructed cottages, often crowded with huge families in just 1 or 2 rooms. He owned the local store, the Tommy shop, where miners were often paid, not in coin of the realm, but in company scrip tokens that could only be spent at this one store. This was the truck system, an insidious cycle of debt and dependency. The company store could charge inflated prices for low-quality goods, ensuring that a miner's wages flowed straight back into the owner's pockets and tying families to the pit through ever-mounting debt. Life revolved around the deafening shriek of the pit whistle, which called men to work before sunrise and released them long after sunset. For 6 days a week, the men of the town would just vanish into the earth. The descent itself was terrifying. Men and boys crowded into a rickety iron cage, which would then plunge into the abyss, sometimes hundreds of feet deep. The flickering light from their tallow candles, which they often had to buy themselves, cast dancing shadows on the wet black rock. Once at the bottom, they entered a different universe. It was a labyrinth of low, narrow tunnels, often just a few feet high, forcing men to work in cramped, unnatural positions. The air was thick with choking coal dust and the constant drip of water. There was no light except for the open flame candles they carried, a constant, terrifying gamble in a world that could be filled with invisible, explosive gas. This underground world had its own brutal hierarchy, and every family member had a role. At the very bottom were the children. The youngest, sometimes just 5 or 6 years old, were the trappers. Their job, like Sarah Gooder's, was to sit in a small niche carved into the tunnel wall for 12 hours at a time, usually in total darkness, because a candle was a luxury they couldn't afford. Their only task was to pull a string to open a ventilation door when they heard a coal tub coming, then let it close again. It demanded constant vigilance. If a child fell asleep and a door was left open, the mine's delicate air currents would be disrupted, letting poisonous gas build up in the tunnels. As they got older, kids would graduate to become hurriers and thrusters. This was backbreaking, dehumanizing work. Hurriers, often older children and women, were strapped into a harness with a belt and a chain that passed between their legs. They were forced to crawl on all fours like animals, dragging heavy tubs of coal that could weigh over 600 kilograms. Behind them, a younger thruster would push the tub with their hands and the top of their head. The testimony of 17-year-old Patience Kershaw is haunting. "The bald place upon my head is made by thrusting the corves," she explained to a government commission. "I hurry the corves a mile and more underground and back. I wear a belt and chain at the workings to get the corves out." The men, the hewers or getters, had the most dangerous and highest paid job of all, working at the coalface. Lying on their sides in cramped spaces, slick with sweat and black dust, they'd hack away at the coal seam with pickaxes. Every swing was a risk. It could bring down tons of unstable rock from the ceiling, the single most common cause of death in the pits. Or worse, a pick could strike a pocket of iron pyrite, creating a spark. In this world, A single spark could be a death sentence for every single person in the mine. This was just a normal day. Death was a constant companion. A father might be crushed by a roof fall. A son might tumble down a shaft, but the pit whistle would blow the next morning all the same. The family simply had to bear the grief and the financial ruin that came with it. But sometimes, something different happened. Sometimes, an accident was so sudden, so catastrophic, that it forced the nation to look down into the darkness it had tried so hard to ignore. One of those days was July 4th, 1838. Part 2. The Huskar Pit. A summer's day. A watery grave, July 4th, 1838. Started as a hot, sunny day in the village of Silkstone in South Yorkshire, deep below the fields. In the Huskar Pit, it was business as usual. Men chipped at the coalface while their children scurried through the darkness, trapping and hurrying. They'd already been down in the pit for 9 hours, and were looking forward to the end of their shift. Around 2 in the afternoon, the sky changed. A violent thunderstorm, shocking even for the region, rolled in over the valley. Rain fell in a torrential downpour. On the surface, people ran for cover, but deep underground, the miners were only dimly aware of the storm. For them, the first sign of trouble was a change in the sound of the world. A low, continuous rumble began to echo down the ventilation shafts. To the terrified children working in the blackness, this sound was the stuff of nightmares. In the enclosed tunnels, the distant peal of thunder sounds horribly similar to the roar of an impending fire damp explosion, the most feared event in any mine. Panic began to ripple through the youngest workers. On the surface, things were getting worse. The intense rain overwhelmed the colliery's drainage. It had also doused the boiler fire for the steam engine that powered the main lift out of the mine. With the engine down, there was no way to bring the workers up. A message was sent down: everyone gather at the pit bottom and wait. But for a group of around 40 children, the fear was too much. 9 hours underground, the terrifying noises, the suffocating darkness, they made a fatal decision. Ignoring an adult miner's instructions to stay put, they decided to run for a different exit. A sloping tunnel known as the Huskar Dayhole, which led directly to the surface. It was their plan B, a desperate dash for daylight. Putting out their candles to avoid igniting any gas, they plunged into absolute blackness and began their frantic scramble through the tunnels. They pushed through a heavy wooden ventilation door at the bottom of the sloping passage and started the hard climb up the dark, slippery incline. What they couldn't have known was that, on the surface, the storm had turned a small stream that ran near the dayhole's entrance into a raging torrent, and that torrent, overflowing its banks, had found the opening. Water was now pouring into the mine through the very exit the children were running towards. As they scrambled up the steep tunnel, they heard a new sound. It wasn't thunder, it was a roar, the sound of a tidal wave of water, churning and surging down the narrow passage right at them. The children at the front saw it. First, a black wall of water crashing towards them in the darkness. Panic became pure terror. The torrent hit them with incredible force, washing them off their feet and sending them tumbling back down the steep slope they had just climbed. Their desperate flight from a phantom explosion had led them straight into a real flood. The water carried them down, a mass of screaming children, and slammed them against the heavy wooden ventilation door at the bottom. The immense pressure of the water pinned the door shut. There was no escape. The narrow tunnel had become a hydraulic trap. As the water rose with terrifying speed, the children were crushed against the door and each other. Their last moments were spent in pitch-black darkness, submerged in a cold, watery grave. A few of the older, stronger children, who had been higher up the slope, managed to scramble into a side passage, where a pocket of air saved them. But for the rest, there was no hope. When the waters finally subsided, rescuers were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. 26 children, 15 boys and 11 girls, aged between 7 and 17, were found piled against the door, their short, brutal lives extinguished in minutes. The community was devastated. One father who went in to help with the recovery found his own child among the dead. The children were carried out, their faces washed, and taken home in carts to their grief-stricken families. The pit that had been their livelihood had become their tomb. Part 3. The Hartley Calamity. A tomb of stone. The tragedy at Huskar Pit was caused by water, an enemy from without. But 24 years later, in 1862, a disaster of a completely different kind would reveal another fundamental flaw in Britain's deadliest job. At the Hartley Colliery in Northumberland, the danger came not from flood or fire, but from the mine's very design. Like many pits of its era, the Hartley Colliery had only one shaft. This single passage, 12 feet wide, was the mine's sole artery to the surface world. It was split down the middle by a wooden partition called a lattice. On one side, the downcast, fresh air and a cage carrying men and coal moved up and down. On the other side, the upcast, stale air, smoke, and the vital pump rods for keeping the mine dry were housed. It was a design that prioritized cost-cutting over safety, creating a single point of failure for the entire mine. On the morning of January 16, 1862, that failure occurred. A shift change was underway, meaning nearly double the usual number of men and boys, 204 in total, were underground. As a cage containing 8 men was being winched to the surface, a sudden, catastrophic crack echoed across the pithead. The enormous 40-ton cast-iron beam of the main pumping engine had snapped in two. One half of the beam plunged directly down the shaft. It smashed through the wooden brattice, tearing out timber and rock, before lodging itself deep in the passage, creating a massive, impenetrable plug of debris. The mine's only exit was sealed. Above ground, chaos reigned. Onlookers could only watch in horror as the shaft, their only connection to the trapped miners, remained blocked. Rescue efforts began immediately, with men lowered on ropes to try and clear the wreckage, but the scale of the blockage was immense. The work was slow, dangerous, and heartbreaking. Periodically, rescuers would stop and listen, and from the depths they could hear knocking, the trapped miners signaling they were still alive. For days, a desperate race against time unfolded. The nation's newspapers carried daily updates, and crowds of anguished family members kept a constant, hopeful vigil at the pithead. What the rescuers knew, and the families feared, was that the trapped men faced not one, but 2 invisible killers. With the pumping engine destroyed, water was slowly but surely rising in the lower levels, and worse, with the ventilation shaft blocked, poisonous gases, carbonic acid gas, or stithe, were building up. It took 6 agonizing days for the rescuers, led by a team of professional sinkers under William Coulson, to finally break through the blockage. When they at last descended into the silent mine, they found the men had escaped the rising water by climbing to a higher seam, but they had not escaped the gas. A rescuer's logbook described the scene. They found the miners in groups. Fathers were sitting with their arms around their sons. Brothers were locked in a final embrace. A final prayer meeting had been held. A slate was found with a last message from one of the foremen, noting their fading hope as the gas took hold. The 204 men and boys had not drowned or been crushed. They had suffocated in the dark, waiting for a rescue that came too late. The Hartley disaster, the entombment of 204 souls, exposed the lethal folly of single-shaft mines. The sheer horror of men being left to die with no alternative escape route led to immediate legislative change. That same year, Parliament passed a new law requiring that all new coal mines must have at least 2 shafts. For the 204 men and boys of Hartley, it came too late, but their sacrifice would ensure no British miner would ever be sealed in a tomb of stone like that again. Part 4. The reckoning in an era where mining accidents were tragically common. The sheer horror of what happened at Huskar Pit, 26 children drowned in the dark, sent a shockwave across Britain. Unlike the countless smaller tragedies, this story was picked up by the national press and spread like wildfire. The public was confronted with an image so appalling it couldn't be ignored. Young girls and boys who had died not in some freak accident, but as a direct result of the horrific conditions they were forced to work in every single day. The outcry was immediate and immense. Queen Victoria herself took a personal interest, demanding answers. The tragedy became a symbol, a lightning rod for a growing movement of social reform. It was no longer possible for polite society to pretend it didn't know what was happening beneath its feet. This public pressure led directly to a royal commission of inquiry, led by the tireless reformer Lord Ashley. For 2 years, his commission gathered evidence, traveling across the country and taking first-hand testimony from the workers themselves, including children. The report they published in 1842 was a bombshell. It was thousands of pages long, filled with heartbreaking accounts of abuse, exhaustion, and degradation. It included the voices of children like Sarah Gooder, who was scared of the dark, and Patience Kershaw, whose head was made bald from pushing coal tubs. For the first time, the British middle and upper classes were forced to confront the human cost in raw, unvarnished detail. To ensure the message hit home, the report included stark illustrations of girls and boys crawling on all fours, chained to heavy loads like animals. Lord Ashley deliberately appealed to Victorian sensibilities, highlighting the shameful and indecent practice of girls and women working half-naked alongside men. The impact of the report, fueled by the memory of the children who drowned at Huskar, was decisive. Despite fierce opposition from mine owners like Lord Londonderry, who argued the reforms were unjust, would harm profits, and that children needed to start young to become good colliers, Parliament passed the Mines and Collieries Act in 1842. It was a landmark piece of legislation. For the first time, it was illegal for any female to work underground in a mine. It also banned boys under the age of 10 from being employed in the pits. The act was not perfect. Enforcement was left to a single, overworked inspector for the entire country, meaning many owners simply ignored it. But it was a staggering victory. The 26 children who died in that flooded tunnel had not died entirely in vain. Their tragedy forced a moral reckoning and became the catalyst for the first real step towards ending the abuse of children in Britain's deadliest industry. But the tragedy at Huskar, caused by water, and at Hartley, caused by a blocked shaft, were only two of the horsemen of the mining apocalypse. An even greater and more frequent danger lurked in the very air the miners breathed. Fire. Part 5. The Invisible Killer. Fire, damp and dust. Water was a visible threat. But the most catastrophic disasters in mining history came from an enemy that was invisible, silent, and odorless. Fire damp. This is the miners' term for methane gas, which is naturally trapped in coal seams. As miners dug, the gas would seep into the tunnels. At a concentration of just 4 to 16% in the air, it becomes a highly volatile explosive. All it needed was a spark. In the early days, that spark came from the miners' own open flame candles. The invention of the Davy safety lamp, whose flame was enclosed in a fine metal gauze that was supposed to prevent it igniting outside gas, greatly reduced the risk, but didn't eliminate it. A damaged lamp, a careless miner, or even a pickaxe striking rock was all it took. But what made things infinitely worse was something that was fully understood at the time: coal dust. That fine black powder that coated every surface and filled the workers' lungs was itself a powerful explosive. A small fire damp ignition could trigger a much larger, more devastating secondary explosion as it ignited the dust in the air, creating a chain reaction that would tear through the entire mine. The result was an instantaneous inferno, followed by a silent, deadly poison after damp. This was the toxic mix of gases, mainly carbon monoxide, left after a blast. For those who survived the fire, the afterdamp would often finish the job, silently killing them where they stood. No disaster illustrates this more horrifically than the tragedy at the Oaks Colliery in Barnsley on December 12, 1866. The Oaks was known to be a gassy pit. A previous explosion in 1847 had already killed 73 people. But on that Wednesday, with Christmas approaching, around 340 men and boys were underground. Just after 1:15 p.m., a cataclysmic explosion ripped through the mine. The blast was so powerful it was heard 3 miles away. On the surface, a deep rumbling was followed by a tremendous rush of air shooting out of the shafts. 2 huge columns of smoke, dust, and debris erupted into the sky, raining soot for miles around. Chaos erupted. Frantic family members rushed to the pit head. Rescue efforts began almost immediately. Brave volunteers descended into the darkness. They found about 20 survivors near the bottom, all badly burned, but only 6 would ultimately live. As rescuers pushed deeper, they found miners collapsed everywhere, killed by the poisonous afterdamp. Fathers and sons were discovered embracing in their final moments. Among the first to volunteer was a respected 37-year-old mining engineer from Derby named Parkin Jeff. Known for his bravery in previous rescues, he immediately took charge, leading teams into the unstable pit. But the mine wasn't finished. The first explosion had started deep underground fires. At 9 a.m. the next morning, a second, even more violent explosion tore through the pit. All 28 rescuers still underground, including the heroic Parkin Jeffcock, were killed instantly. The mine was now a raging inferno. The third explosion followed. The situation seemed hopeless. But then, on Friday morning, 2 days after the first blast, the signal bell at the top of the shaft suddenly rang. Someone was still alive. A bottle of brandy and water was lowered. When the rope came up, the bottle was gone. 2 engineers, John Mamet and Thomas Embleton Jr., volunteered for a perilous descent in a bucket. At the bottom they found one man, Samuel Brown, a rescuer who had been knocked unconscious by the second blast and had taken shelter. He was the last person to come out of the Oaks Colliery alive. Over the next few days, 14 more explosions rocked the pit. Finally, the agonizing decision was made to seal the shafts with dirt and clay, entombing the dead to smother the fire. In total, an estimated 361 men and boys lost their lives, including the volunteers who had gone down to save them. The Oaks Colliery disaster was the deadliest mining accident in British history to that date, leaving behind 337 widows and over 1,000 fatherless children. A relief fund was set up, with Queen Victoria herself donating £200 to support the devastated community. Conclusion: the stories of Huskar Pit, Hartley Colliery, and the Oaks are just 3 chapters in a long, dark history written in coal and blood. For every major disaster that caught the nation's attention, there were thousands of smaller, forgotten tragedies that unfolded in the dark every day. Roof falls, runaway carts, snapped ropes, and the slow grinding death from black lung, the disease caused by a lifetime of breathing in coal dust. The world they built, which is now our world, was forged in these subterranean deaths. The comfort and progress of the Victorian age, and the very foundations of our modern society, were paid for by the lives of men, women, and children who were asked to make an impossible sacrifice. But their sacrifice wasn't entirely for nothing. The public horror over the 26 children drowned at Huskar led directly to laws that pulled women and young children out of the pits for good. The entombment of 204 men at Hartley forced Parliament to mandate a second escape shaft for every mine, a law that would save countless lives in the future. The terrifying infernos, like the one at Oaks, pushed forward the science of mine safety and ventilation. Every regulation that exists today, every rule about structural support and protective equipment is a legacy of these disasters. They are monuments to the dead, written into law. The great pits are silent now and the winding wheels are still. But the memory of Britain's deadliest job endures, a solemn reminder of the true price of progress, and of the ordinary people who were forced to pay it.